The rain was pouring down heavily when Kevin pulled over to replace a flat tire on his truck. Why did it have to happen to me in such weather, too? The young man lamented. Unfortunately, only a couple of drivers passed by, and they all ignored Kevin's calls for help. The situation was further complicated by the fact that the young long-haul trucker had a flat front tire. If it had been a rear tire, Kevin could have made it to the nearest car shop. The fall turned out to be exceptionally rainy, which wasn't typical for the state of Maine. Kevin had already crossed nearly half of the country when he drove over a massive rusty nail that forced him to pull over for repairs. A few minutes later, the young man was soaking wet, and he hadn't even had the chance to get the tools out or set up the jack yet. Why did I agree to go alone? So my partner got sick. It happens. But I should have just stayed home or asked the dispatcher to send someone else. But no, I had to go looking for adventures. Kevin grumbled. The rain was pouring down the back of his jacket, making him shiver like an autumn leaf. Being all wet, the young trucker had dropped the slippery wrench twice already. At that moment, someone gently placed their hand on Kevin's shoulder. The young man jumped and turned his head slowly. Beyond Kevin stood a sturdy, fit old man in a raincoat and rubber boots. The stranger was holding a small fishing rod and a plastic bucket with his catch. I went fishing and got caught in the rain. Just my luck. Could you maybe give me a lift? The old man asked, somewhat shyly. Kevin wiped the raindrops off his face and nodded briefly, pointing to the cabin door as if to say, "Get in. I'll just change the tire and we'll be on our way." The old man didn't need a repeat invitation, and a second later, he was already sitting in the truck, listening to the news broadcast on the radio. Kevin frowned, but he wasn't mad at the old man. It wasn't like he could offer much help, given that changing a tire required some brute strength. Kevin realized that he needed to pull himself together, stop complaining about the weather, and get the job done. Finally, the tire was replaced, and the young trucker could climb into the warm cabin to catch his breath and dry off a bit. At that moment, the old man immediately handed him a cup of coffee he had poured from his thermos. A contented smile immediately appeared on Kevin's lips. That clearly was a good companion that joined him on his route, although he didn't feel so at first. Having finished his cup of coffee, Kevin warmed up and started the engine and continued on his way. As it turned out, his passenger's name was Michael Miller. Born in Oregon, he had always had a deep love for the natural beauty of his homeland, the dense forests and full flowing rivers. Kevin, on the other hand, hailed from Texas, a place with a climate vastly different from the northeastern states. Mr. Miller had always been a fan of hunting and fishing. He could talk about it for hours, recalling unforgettable moments that had left a lasting impact on him. Kevin listened in silence. He didn't understand much about hunting, but he didn't want to cut off his talkative companion. Besides, Mr. Miller was an excellent storyteller. Finally, when the passenger seemed to have run out of stories to tell and fell silent, Kevin turned the radio dial to find a station. There was an educational program on air, dedicated to eyewitness accounts of encounters with snowmen, mythical creatures commonly known as YETI. The mention of this legendary being immediately piqued Mr. Miller's interest, and a feverish sparkle appeared in his eyes. Kevin didn't pay much attention to the show. He'd heard such stories before. There was always someone claiming to have seen or heard something, but there was never any concrete evidence. However, what Mr. Miller said just a minute later left Kevin genuinely astonished. Oh, they don't know anything about the YETI. He actually looks entirely different. Have you ever seen a YETI? The trucker couldn't help but ask. His voice was tinged with blatant irony, which the elderly man immediately sensed. Have I seen a YETI? More than that. I was within a few feet of one, the old man exclaimed. Kevin shook his head uncertainly. If he had previously treated the passenger's words with respect, he now regarded him as just another storyteller. But Mr. Miller had no intention of giving up. What's more, the old man decided to prove his point with a story he had a hard time believing himself. It happened over 40 years ago. Back then, Michael Miller was a man in his prime, passionate about hunting and baseball. He lived in Oregon at the time. The climate was not much different from Maine, where he had settled now. Michael often went hunting with his friend, Tom Brown. They mostly went out on the weekends. They had been friends since school, when Tom was the star of the local football team, playing quarterback. Despite the fact that their paths diverged for a while after high school, they still maintained a friendly relationship. This was because Tom had finished med school and was preparing to start his first job at a hospital. Michael, on the other hand, decided to dedicate his life to teaching literature at the local school. But what they truly had in common was their shared love for hunting. They were especially fond of deer hunting, an experience that was impossible to forget. Most of the time, it was Michael who selected the local hunting spots. He excelled in this role and was unmatched in his knowledge of hunting grounds. However, on that memorable occasion, it was Tom who took on this responsibility. The location was perfect, but the weather let them down. It had been raining lightly since early morning, but the friends still decided not to cancel the trip. They were too eager to try out their new gear. As the day progressed, the rain intensified and the wind picked up. The friends decided to wait out the bad weather in the car because by then the roads were in rough shape and they didn't want to risk getting stuck. At first, everything was as expected. The friends sat in their car and talked about life. Then Tom suggested visiting one of the nearby caves. Michael raised an eyebrow in surprise. Why not? It's not a bad idea. We could start a fire there and maybe roast a rabbit. We can't survive on sandwiches alone for long. Tom smiled. He enjoyed the role of the guide he had chosen for himself. He felt like the leader of this expedition. After the small car, the cave seemed like a luxury suite in one of the city's upscale hotels. It seemed like we're not the only ones who have stayed here. Look, they even left firewood and kindling. Michael noticed with satisfaction. Yeah, I heard about this cave from experienced hunters, although they preferred not to stay here overnight, Tom said. Michael started feeling uneasy. Why? What's wrong with this place? What are they afraid of? It looks like a regular cave to me. There are all kinds of rumors going around about this cave. They say that it's not only people who come here, even large animals pass through it sometimes. Tom replied as he skewered a rabbit on a sharp stick. Such stories couldn't frighten Michael. Come on, I've heard these stories about yetis and other mythical creatures. Has anyone seen them in real life? No, then we shouldn't even talk about them. Soon, the aroma of roasted meat filled the entire cave, attracting a few small animals. The friends shared their leftovers with them and decided to go to sleep. Meanwhile, the weather outside was still horrible. Around midnight, the campfire had almost burnt out, so Michael had to get up to add more firewood. However, as soon as he approached the pile of branches, he realized that they were not alone in that cave. Michael froze, and in the dying embers of the campfire saw a powerful humanoid figure standing on its hind legs. It remotely resembled a human, but Michael couldn't say for sure. Only when Michael threw a few branches onto the fire did it become evident that they were facing a Yeti. Michael gently nudged Tom on the shoulder and then covered his mouth with his hand while pointing to their guest. The young doctor's eyes widened with fear while an unpleasant shiver ran down his spine. Oh my God, it's a Yeti. So the hunters, they were telling the truth, Tom whispered. Michael stood there, gazing at the humanoid creature covered in thick fur. The broad forehead and massive brow ridges, as well as the well-developed chest, made it look like someone from prehistoric times. Michael had once heard that Yetis were peculiar relics of the past, an evolutionary dead end with their development stuck on the level of large primates. To the surprise of the two friends, their visitor was behaving rather calmly and wasn't showing any aggression. That was especially fortunate since Michael and Tom had nothing to fend off the Yeti with, as they had left their guns in the car to avoid getting them wet. But when they heard a muffled groan in the cave, the friends realized that there was yet someone else in the cave. They heard the moan again, only louder this time. Against his better judgment, Tom approached the source of the sound and froze in surprise. Lord, there's a female here too, and she's pregnant. And she's about to go into labor. Michael turned pale. Most likely, the couple had found the cave in advance to make it their birthing nest. But something went wrong. The female moaned again, and Michael felt a wave of compassion. Listen, you're a doctor after all. Maybe you can help her. Tom hesitated and looked at his friend with doubt. However, when the male Yeti tried to communicate something, Michael understood that he was asking for help. With trembling legs, Tom approached the female and started assisting her. Throughout the birthing process, Michael's only thought was for everything to go well. Otherwise, they could end up staying in that cave forever as silent victims of the Yeti. But when the characteristic baby cry was heard, Michael breathed a sigh of relief. The baby's cry was remarkably human, as children are all the same, regardless of their developmental differences. Tears welled up in the male Yeti's eyes. He looked at Michael, then came closer and gently touched his shoulder with a massive hand. Michael interpreted it as a gesture of gratitude. Having decided to give the new parents some privacy, Tom and Michael tossed the last bits of firewood onto the fire and headed back to the car. It was already getting light outside, so it was time for them to go home. Neither Michael nor Tom had ever encountered the Yeti again. Of course, they came back to that same cave rather often, but they never found any signs of humanoid creatures. Having made the decision not to tell anyone about the incident, the two friends pledged to keep it a secret. Michael kept his secret for over 40 years, and only now, when his friend was no longer alive, did he decide to reveal it. Kevin listened to Mr. Miller and couldn't decide if the old man was telling the truth or not. Half an hour later, they had parted ways since they were headed in different directions. Kevin continued his journey, and Mr. Miller got off at his stop. But ever since then, not a day went by without the trucker thinking about the elderly hunter's incredible night alongside a family of Yetis.